"Stay with me," Gideon begged the freezing half-buried stranger, and that whisper would cost him everything, though neither of them knew, yet it would also save them both. He did not have her name. He did not know she was Chiricahua Apache, cut off from her whole band in a blizzard that had already claimed 2 of their horses and had nearly claimed her. He only knew that if he rode past this one dark shape in the white, the way every hard-taught survival instinct was screaming at him to do, he would spend the rest of his life unable to forgive himself for it. So he got down off his horse into snow, past his knees, and started digging with his bare hands, and that single choice, made in the worst hour of a screaming December night, would end weeks later with an entire Apache nation riding to his gate, and a frightened town bracing for a war that never came. This is the story of Izel and Gideon Marsh, of a blizzard that should have ended a life and instead began 2 new ones. Stories like this take real work to tell. Right, tap join beside the channel name and become a member, and let's go back to the night the storm nearly won. The snow had been coming down since before noon, but it was the wind that did the real damage, a flat, relentless howl out of the northwest that turned falling snow into something closer to grape shot, driving it sideways until a man could lose the outline of his own barn 30 feet from the porch. By 4 in the afternoon, the light had gone the color of old dishwater, and by 5 it was full dark, though the kitchen clock still claimed an hour of daylight remained. Gideon Marsh had been out since morning chasing a dozen head of cattle that had drifted from the north pasture before the storm sealed the gate shut with a wall of snow, and he was riding home later than any sensible man would, half frozen himself, aware the whole way that this was exactly the kind of stubborn decision that got a man killed in a New Mexico Territory winter. He was 32 years old, though the last 11 months had put lines into his face that made him look older when the light was unkind. He ran 400 acres of scrub grass and rock alone, a spread his father had carved from nothing, along with a debt at the Territorial Bank and a house that had gone quiet in a way. Houses were never built to be quiet. He had a wife once. Her name was Rachel, and a fever had taken her the previous February. 3 days from healthy to gone, breaking something in him that 11 months had not managed to mend. He did not let his mind land on the particular shape of her laugh anymore, or the way she used to stand in the kitchen doorway with flour dusted on her hands, because if he let it land there, even for a second, the whole day would come apart around him. Work was the only medicine that held. So he worked, and he rode out chasing drifting cattle into blizzards. He had no business entering, because a man chasing cattle could not also be a man sitting alone in a silent house, thinking about his wife. He nearly missed her entirely, and that fact would haunt him pleasantly for the rest of his life, how close the whole story came to never happening at all. He was maybe 2 miles from his own gate, following the fence line by feel more than sight, when his horse balked at a low rise in the snow that had no business being there. Gideon nearly pushed the animal past it, nearly convinced himself it was a drift piled against a fence post or a fallen branch, and kept riding toward the warm light he could just make out a mile off through the white. His hands had gone past feeling the reins properly, everything in him that had learned, across 11 hard months, how to survive by not stopping and not looking too closely at things wanted to keep moving. But the horse would not go past it, ears pinned, stamping in place with a stubbornness that finally cut through his own cold, numbed thinking. He swung down to see what had spooked the animal, and found, half exposed, where the wind had scoured the drift thin in one place, the curve of a human shoulder beneath packed snow, and beneath that, dark hair gone stiff with frost. He did not remember deciding to move. His hands were already tearing at the snow before his mind caught up, uncovering a shoulder, then an arm bent close against a chest in the last posture a body takes trying to hold its own warmth in, and finally, a face, a young woman's face, lips gone, the gray-blue of a color no living mouth should be, lashes crusted white. So still that for one terrible second, Gideon was certain he had dug up a body he was already too late to save. He pressed 2 fingers under her jaw the way his own father had once shown him on a man pulled from a frozen stock tank, and found, faint and slow and stuttering, a pulse. It was the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment. A woman freezing to death 2 miles from his gate, no wagon, no way to hold a fire against this wind, and a night that would only turn colder. He set it low, right against her ear before he had decided to say anything at all. "Stay with me," and worked his coat off his own shoulders to wrap around her, knowing even as he did it that the coat would never be enough on its own. He gathered her against his chest, felt the terrible dead weight of a body that had stopped fighting to hold itself together, and got them both up onto his horse, holding her the way a man holds something he has already refused to lose. The 2 miles home took the better part of an hour in that wind, the horse picking its way half-blind while Gideon steered by memory of his own land, one arm locked around the woman in front of him, feeling for any change in the shallow, stuttering breath against his chest. He got them through his own front door somewhere near full dark, kicked it shut against the storm, and did not stop moving. He built the fire until the front room roared, worked the frozen buckskin from her with hands shaking from cold and urgency both, wrapped her in every blanket in the house, and when the shivering that should have started did not come, the dangerous quiet stillness of a body that had given up warming itself, he did the last thing left in his father's old winter lessons. He got in beside her, under every blanket he owned, and held her against the whole length of his own body, because a fire across a room could not reach blood gone this cold, and skin against skin was the only tool left in a night that had already taken nearly everything else from her. She did not wake for hours. Gideon lay in the firelight holding a stranger he had no name for, watching for the shiver that would mean her body had decided to keep fighting, and somewhere in that long watch he found himself talking to her, low, steady, the way a man talks to a spooked horse or a dying calf, that she was safe, that the fire was warm, that she was not going to die in his front room tonight if he had anything at all to say about it. He did not examine why it mattered this much. He only knew that somewhere in the last hour, chasing warmth back into a stranger's body, something locked shut in his own chest for 11 months had cracked open just enough to let something back in. Near midnight the shivering finally came, violent and full body, her core fighting its way back from wherever it had gone, and Gideon had never in his life felt such relief at watching a person shake uncontrollably against him. He fed the fire until sweat ran down his own back, and somewhere past 2 in the morning her eyes opened. They were dark, and for a long moment held nothing but confusion, and a fear so raw it made his own chest ache to look at the fear of a person waking somewhere unfamiliar, wrapped around a man she had never seen, with no memory of how she came to be there. He held himself still. He kept his voice low. "You're safe. You were near froze to death, out past my fence line. I'm not going to hurt you. I just need you warm." She gave him no answer that first night, whether from exhaustion, weariness, or a language gap. He had not yet discovered, Gideon could not tell. But she held his eyes a long, searching moment, some fierce private calculation moving behind them, and whatever she found there must have satisfied some minimum measure of trust, because her body finally went slack again, and she slept. He did not sleep that first night, even after the fever had broken and her breathing had settled into something steady and unafraid. He lay awake in the gray hour before dawn, turning over the plain, uncomfortable fact of what he had just done, carried a total stranger into the bed he had shared with Rachel, held her the way he had once held his wife through her own final fever, and felt something in his chest respond to another human being's nearness for the first time in 11 months. It shamed him a little that first morning, though he could not have said exactly why. It felt, in the raw gray light, like a kind of betrayal of a woman who could no longer object to anything he did. But lying there listening to a stranger breathe, steady and alive in a house that had held only silence for nearly a year, Gideon found he could not make himself regret the decision that had put her there. Whatever this was, obligation, instinct, the simple animal relief of not being the only living thing in a quiet house. He decided somewhere in that gray hour that he would sort out the shape of it later, and for now be grateful only that she had lived to make him wonder about it at all. Her name, he would learn over the days that followed, was Izel. She was Chiricahua Apache, 22 years old, and the reason she had been alone in a blizzard 2 miles from a rancher's fence line was a story that took her far longer to hand him than her name had, because it was not a small story, and it sat underneath everything else that happened between them for the rest of that long winter. Izel woke fully the next morning to the smell of coffee, and the particular disorientation of a body that had nearly died and did not entirely believe the reprieve was real. She felt warmth first, a startling amount of it, banked fire and heavy wool, and a stillness in her own limbs that meant she had slept longer and deeper than she had in days. She felt, second, the man moving quietly across the room, his back turned, giving her the privacy to wake without an audience. She filed that detail away the way she had learned to file every piece of a stranger's character for 3 years now, because information was survival, and she had survived on very little else. She did not trust him yet, and she would not have apologized to anyone for that caution. She had watched an army patrol scatter her family's winter camp 18 months before, had watched her people run in a dozen directions into canyon country with nothing but what they carried on their backs. She had lost her mother that same winter to a cough that turned to fever, with no proper shelter left to fight it in. She had a father somewhere in the foothills, if he still lived, and a younger brother she had not seen in 4 months, and she had been traveling toward a gathering point her scattered band had arranged for the deep winter, when the storm caught her alone and turned 2 familiar days of travel into a white wall she could not read through. She remembered the cold reaching a point past pain, into something almost peaceful, her body deciding on its own that lying down in the snow was the sensible thing left to do. She remembered a voice, and hands, and being lifted, and then nothing, until she woke under a strange roof with a rancher, watching her the way a man watches something he is afraid might still break. She sat up slowly, testing her own strength, and found his eyes already on her, careful, watchful, but not the kind of look she had learned to fear from white men on this land. He crossed the room with a plate of food, keeping a careful distance, setting it within her reach rather than pressing it into her hands directly. Another small piece of information, filed away. A man who did not crowd her. There's food, when you're ready, coffee, too, if you can stomach it. No rush on either. Izel studied him a long moment before she reached for the plate, not from the hunger she refused to let show, though hunger was very much present, but from the instinct that had kept her alive 18 months of running. Never take anything from a stranger's hand until she understood the cost attached to it. What do you want for this? The question landed somewhere unexpected in him. He was quiet a moment. Nothing. You were dying in the snow. I dug you out because leaving you there wasn't a thing I could live with, not because I'm owed something for it. He held her eyes steady. When you're strong enough to leave, you leave. Door's not locked. I just didn't care to bury another body this winter that I could have stopped. Something in asterisk, another body asterisk, caught her attention, though. She let it pass that first morning. She ate slowly, watching him, cataloging the small, quiet details of the room. A woman's shawl folded on a shelf that had clearly gone untouched a long while. A second chair at the table, sitting unused. A house built for 2 people that now carried the hollow feel of holding only one. Izel had lost enough, in 18 months, to recognize the shape of grief in a room even before she understood its source, and she filed that away too, though she pressed no further. Gideon gave his name that morning and asked for hers in turn, and she gave it, Izel, and nothing more. Watching to see what he would do with even that small piece of her, he did not push for the rest. He simply fixed it in memory and went back to whatever quiet work the ranch demanded. leaving her the privacy of her own thoughts, which she understood even then as its own kind of gift. The days that followed fell into a wary, careful rhythm neither of them had planned. Izel's body needed time to recover fully from what the cold had nearly taken. Fingers and toes that ached fiercely as feeling crept back, a deep exhaustion that took days to lift, and Gideon gave her that time without comment or demand, tending the fire and bringing food and otherwise leaving her the freedom to heal on her own terms. She noticed he never once tried to touch her beyond what the emergency of that first night had required. She noticed he knocked, quietly, before entering any room she was resting in, her comfort mattering, to him independent of anything she could give back. Small things. She counted them into the private ledger. She had learned to keep on every stranger who crossed her path. By the fourth day she was strong enough to be useful, and being useful, she discovered, was a far more comfortable place to stand than being a burden a stranger's charity had to carry. She moved through his kitchen with a quiet competence that surprised him, mending a torn seam with stitches finer than his own clumsy attempts, catching a rattle in his stove flue before he noticed it himself, working a poultice from her own gathered stores against the raw chapping the frost had left on her hands. Gideon watched her prepare it with open, unguarded curiosity, which she found, to her own mild surprise, she did not mind. "You know medicine," he ventured one evening, watching her grind something fragrant between two flat stones. "My mother taught me, and her mother taught her." Izel did not look up from her work. "It is not a small thing what we carry. Your soldiers call it superstition. It kept my band alive through winters far worse than this one, long before your people ever came to this land." There was no anger in it, only a flat, unshakable certainty, and Gideon, to his credit, did not argue. He only nodded and wondered aloud what the herb was called, sounding as though he genuinely wanted the answer rather than simply enduring it, and Izel found herself, for the first time in 18 months, explaining something about her people to a white man who seemed to actually want to understand. That was how the thaw began. Not with one dramatic moment, but 100 small ones, each a tiny brick laid in a wall. Neither of them had meant to build. Gideon learned that she did not need rescuing twice, that the woman he had pulled half-frozen from a drift was underneath the exhaustion of that first week, sharp-eyed and capable and unwilling to remain anyone's charity case a moment longer than necessary. Izel learned that the rancher who had dug her out asked nothing in return. He had not already given freely first, and that the hollow quiet in his house was not indifference but grief, worn the way a man wears a wound. He has let no one help him tend. The wariness cut both directions, and it did not vanish overnight simply because one act of kindness had opened a door. 12 days into her stay, Gideon rode into the small town nearest his ranch for supplies, and Izel, restless after so many days confined indoors, went with him against her own better judgment, wrapped in a borrowed coat with her hair bound back, hoping to pass through unremarked. She did not pass through unremarked. A shopkeeper's wife, sweeping her own front step, went rigid at the sight of her, and a man loading a wagon 2 doors down muttered something to his companion that he clearly meant her to overhear, a word Izel had heard aimed at her people more times than she cared to count. She did not flinch, and she did not look to Gideon to fight her battle for her. She had survived 18 months of exactly this kind of small cruelty with her spine straight and her chin level, and she was not about to let one sour man in a supply town undo that discipline now. She simply held the man's stare until he was the one who looked away first and walked on into the mercantile as though he had not spoken at all. Gideon, a step behind her, had gone rigid himself, his jaw set hard enough to ache, and it took every ounce of self-control he owned not to cross the street and say something he would likely regret. Izel caught the look on his face inside the store and set a hand briefly on his arm. "I do not need you to fight that man for me." Her voice was even, certain, I have carried worse than his ugly mouth across 100 miles of open country. What I need from you, if you want to be useful, is to stand beside me and let the town see that you do not agree with him. Not to make yourself my rescuer twice over. I already have a rescuer. I do not need another performance of it in a mercantile." Gideon absorbed that, and something in his shoulders eased. The fight in him redirected into something quieter, and he understood watching her face considerably more useful to her. He stayed beside her the rest of the errand, spoke to the shopkeeper with plain, unhurried courtesy that made clear where he stood without a single raised voice, and rode home beside her that afternoon with a new and clear-eyed respect for exactly how much strength this woman had been carrying long before a blizzard ever put her in his path. That night, riding home from town in silence, Izel found her thoughts drifting where they drifted most often in her quiet hours, to her younger brother, a boy of 16 the last time she had held him. Quick with a bow and quicker with a joke, somewhere out in the same foothills her father was searching. She did not know if he still lived. She had learned across 18 months of scattering and searching to hold that kind of not knowing the way her people had always held it, not by pretending it did not sit heavy in her chest, but by refusing to let the weight of it stop her hands from working, her feet from walking, her voice from speaking plainly to whoever stood in front of her. She had promised herself the night the army swept through her family's camp that she would not become a woman who was only grief, wearing a living body. She looked over at Gideon riding silent beside her, still simmering faintly from the mercantile, and understood with a small private surprise that some part of her had already begun keeping that promise on this ranch without entirely noticing she was doing it. She learned about Rachel 11 days later, still on a night when a fresh storm rattled the windows and Gideon sat too long and too still beside the fire, his eyes fixed somewhere past the flames. Izel, who had grown skilled at reading silence in a man, did not press directly. She simply sat across from him with her own mending, and let the quiet stretch until he was ready to fill it, or not, on his own terms. The same courtesy he had once extended her returned in full. "My wife died last February." He gave it to the fire, not to her, his voice carefully flat, in the way of a man keeping a great deal of weight pinned under very few words. "Fever. 3 days. Start to finish. I've got a ranch and 400 head of cattle and a house I built with my own hands. For the two of us, and none of it much matters." Most days he was quiet a long moment. "I dug you out of that snow because I couldn't stomach burying anybody else this year. That's the truth of it. Wasn't nobility. I just couldn't." Izel set down her mending. She did not reach for the easy, practiced comfort a stranger might offer, words that cost nothing and meant less. She gave him instead the only thing she had that felt true. "My mother died the same winter. Yours did. A cough, then a fever, in a canyon camp with no proper shelter, because your soldiers had scattered us from the one we had." She held his eyes across the fire. "I do not tell you this, so you will feel the weight of it. I tell you this because I understand exactly the size of the hole you are describing. Grief that big does not care whose fault it was. It only cares that the person is gone and you are still here. Something passed between them that neither of them had words for, yet not romance, not that early, but recognition, the particular bond of two people who had each carried an identical, isolating weight and had just discovered, for the first time in a very long while, that they were no longer carrying it entirely alone in the room. "I'm sorry about your mother," he managed quietly, and meant it in a way that carried past the ordinary courtesy of the words. "I'm sorry about your wife." Izel picked her mending back up, but her eyes lingered on him a moment longer. "Grief shared is not grief halved. My grandmother taught me that also. But it is, perhaps, grief that does not feel quite so much like being buried alive." Neither of them pressed further that night, but something had shifted, quietly and permanently, in the space between them. The wary distance of stranger and rescued stranger giving ground, inch by inch, to something neither of them had experienced in a very long time, the simple, unguarded relief of being understood. The weeks that followed deepened that thaw in ways neither of them announced or examined too closely, the way people rarely do examine the exact moment loneliness becomes something else. Izel stayed on through the worst of the deep winter, in part because the storms made travel toward her scattered band close to suicidal, and in part, though she did not say this aloud, not yet, not even to herself in so many words, because the ranch had become, without her, quite deciding it should. Somewhere she was no longer counting the days until she could leave. She earned her keep many times over, and made certain he knew it, some proud, unbending part of her, refusing to let this arrangement settle into anything resembling charity from either direction. She mended fence beside him when the weather allowed, worked a garden of dried stores back into something usable, doctored a sick calf with a poultice that had the animal on its feet in 2 days when Gideon's own remedies had failed outright. He in turn built her a proper room off the back of the house rather than let her keep sleeping on a pallet by the front room fire, working through 2 bitter weekends with a stubbornness she recognized because it matched her own. When she asked why he had gone to that trouble for a guest who might leave with the first thaw, he only shrugged and allowed that a person deserved a door that closed, and did not explain further, though the answer sat in both their chests a while after. There were harder nights, too. A fever took her hard in the 2nd month, some lingering after effect of the cold that had nearly killed her, and Gideon sat up 3 nights running watching her sweat through it, doing everything her own remedies and his own limited knowledge could manage, frightened in a way he had not let himself feel since Rachel's last 3 days. When the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, he found himself standing outside her door with his forehead against the frame, shaking with a relief too large to hold quietly, and Izel, weak but lucid, watched him through the half-open door and understood, with total clarity, that this man was no longer merely a rescuer keeping a stranger fed through a hard winter. He had become someone whose fear for her mattered to her in a way that frightened her more than the fever had. If their story is holding you the way it held us researching it, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and help keep stories like this one coming. By the 3rd month, something had settled between them that neither of them had a tidy word for. It was not courtship in any form either of their peoples would formally have recognized. It was smaller and quieter, the particular ease of 2 people who had learned each other's silences, who no longer needed to fill every quiet moment with talk, who had built, unremarkable brick by unremarkable brick, a trust that neither grief nor culture. Izel taught him words of her own language, laughing, a real laugh, rare and startling the first time he heard it, doing something to his chest he did not examine too closely at his terrible attempts to repeat them back. Gideon taught her in turn the rhythm of a working cattle ranch, and found her a faster study than he had ever been himself, quick-eyed and precise in a way that had him, more than once, simply standing back and watching her work with an admiration he made no effort to hide. Their skills traded hands as easily as their words did by then. Izel taught him to read sign in fresh snow the way her mother had taught her, the difference between a deer's unhurried wander and a wolf pack's deliberate line, the story a single broken branch could tell a patient eye, crouching beside him in the cold with a focus that made Gideon feel like a genuine student rather than a man who already assumed he knew his own land better than anyone could teach him. He, in turn, taught her to throw a rope with something approaching his own competence, laughing outright the first dozen times her loop went wide and tangled in the corral dust, until on the 13th try she dropped it clean over a fence post from 20 feet and turned to him with an expression of such pure, startled triumph that he found himself grinning back at her for no reason he could have explained to anyone, and thinking, not for the first time that winter, that he had forgotten a person could make him feel this plainly glad simply by being good at something new. Christmas came and went quietly that year, the first Gideon had marked since Rachel's death, and he nearly let it pass unremarked the way he had let most calendar days pass since February. work being easier than memory on a day built for family. Izel would not allow it. She had no particular claim on the holiday herself, but she had watched him go distant and short-spoken as the date approached and guessed correctly at the shape of what he was avoiding, and on the morning itself she set a small carved figure on the table beside his coffee, a horse. The kind of small, useless, beautiful thing a person makes only for someone they have decided matters to them. Gideon turned it over in his hands a long while without speaking, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet in a way he made no attempt to hide from her, which surprised them both. It was, he told her later, the first day since Rachel that had felt like a day worth marking rather than simply a day worth surviving, and Izel understood, hearing that, exactly how far the thaw between them had already carried them both without either one fully admitting it aloud. He kept his distance beyond what the work required for a long while, some careful, deliberate restraint that Izel noticed, and in her private ledger weighed heavily in his favor. She had known men in 18 months of displacement who mistook a woman's vulnerability for an invitation, and she had learned to read the warning signs of that kind of man early and clearly. Gideon carried none of them. He gave her room. He waited to be asked rather than assumed, and so when the distance between them finally did close, it closed slowly, on terms that were entirely, unmistakably, her own choosing. It happened on an ordinary evening in late January, mending harness by lamplight at the same table, her hands passing him a tool before he needed to reach for it in the easy rhythm two people fall into after months of shared work, and Gideon looked up to find her already watching him, some question sitting plainly in her dark eyes that she was not working to hide. He set the harness down. I think about my wife every day still. I expect I always will. I'm not looking for you to fill a space that was hers. That wouldn't be fair to either of you. I do not want her space. Izel's voice stayed steady, certain. I have my own grief and my own missing people, and I am not looking to be poured into the shape of someone I never knew. I'm asking only whether there is room, in a life this full of loss, for something new to grow beside the old grief, rather than replacing it. She held his eyes. I think perhaps there is. I would like to find out if you would. He crossed the small distance between them and kissed her, careful and unhurried. And Izel, who had spent 18 months learning exactly how much of herself she could safely give without losing the rest, found she did not want to hold back from this the way survival had trained her to hold back from everything else. It was both of them understood without a word passing between them, a beginning neither of grief nor of guardedness, but of something neither had let themselves believe they would ever have again. The peace of that late winter did not last uninterrupted, because the world beyond the ranch had not stopped turning, while two grieving people learned each other by firelight, and in the first week of February, word reached them both, in different ways, that changed the shape of everything that came next. It came first to Izel, carried by an old trader who passed through the territory each winter, moving goods between scattered camps and isolated ranches alike, a man Gideon trusted enough to let onto his land. The trader carried news of her band that her father had survived the scattering after all, had spent the winter searching every canyon and gathering point in the territory for a daughter he feared lost to the same storm that nearly killed her, and that word of a Chiricahua woman sheltered and healed at a rancher's spread had finally, after weeks of searching, reached the right ears through a chain of quiet allies who moved between both worlds. Her father knew where she was, and he was coming. Izel felt the news land in her chest as two separate weights at once, a flood of relief, so total it nearly buckled her knees. Her father alive, her family not entirely lost after all, and beneath that, unexpected and unwelcome, a cold thread of fear she did not examine too closely at first. Fear of what her father's arrival, and the return to her people it would surely demand, meant for the life she had quietly, unexpectedly, begun building on this ranch, with this man, in a house that had started to feel, against every careful instinct she owned, like somewhere she belonged. The second piece of news reached Gideon 3 days later, from the direction of town, and it arrived with none of the quiet dignity of the trader's message. It arrived as panic. A rider came hard up the ranch road at midday, his horse near lathered, shouting before he had even reined in that riders had been sighted, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, coming down out of the foothills toward the valley, and the town, already jumpy after a decade of frontier fear stories that rarely bothered separating one band's grievance from another's, had already begun bracing for the worst. Some were saying raid, some were saying war party. A few of the more excitable voices in town were already talking about riding out to meet the threat before it reached anyone's front door, which was, Gideon understood with a cold drop in his stomach, exactly the kind of frightened, trigger-happy mistake that turned a peaceful approach into a bloodbath before either side had a chance to explain itself. He looked at Izel, standing in his doorway, with her chin already lifting into the same fierce, unbowed posture he had first seen the morning she woke in his front room, and understood before she uttered a single word exactly who was riding down out of those foothills, and exactly why. "That's my father." Her voice did not shake. "And likely my whole band with him, or what remains of it. He would not ride with numbers like that for a raid." He would ride with numbers like that, to be certain. No one mistakes his intentions, and start something none of us wanted. She held Gideon's eyes, steady despite the fear plainly moving underneath. "But your town does not know that, and frightened men with guns make mistakes that cannot be taken back." Gideon did not hesitate. "Then we ride out and meet them before the town does anything foolish. Together. You standing beside me is the only thing that stops this turning into exactly the disaster everyone's afraid of." They rode out that same afternoon ahead of whatever panic was building in town out toward the ridge where the riders had first been sighted, and as they crested the last rise and the full column came into view, Gideon felt something close to awe settle over the fear in his chest. It was not dozens. It was closer to 200 men on horseback riding in careful, disciplined formation. No paint, no weapons raised, but an unmistakable, overwhelming show of presence that made plain, to anyone with the sense to read it, that this was a people who had come to be taken seriously. At the front of the column rode a man Izel recognized instantly, and the sound she made seeing him, a single, sharp cry, half relief and half disbelief, spurring her horse forward before Gideon could react, told him everything he needed to know about who led that formation. Her father reined up hard as she reached him, and for a long moment neither of them managed a word. The 200 riders behind him, going still and silent as their leader, simply held his daughter's face in both hands and looked at her as though memorizing every detail of it against the fear of another 18 months without her. Gideon hung back, giving them the moment, but he was aware of 200 sets of eyes turning, one by one, from the reunion to the white rancher who had ridden out to meet them, and he understood, sitting his horse alone on that ridge, that whatever happened in the next several minutes, a lean young rider near the front of the column, no older than 16 or 17, broke formation without waiting for permission and pushed his horse forward at a reckless pace, and for one heart-stopping second, Gideon saw a dozen hands drop toward weapons. Then Izel turned, saw the boy's face, and the sound that tore out of her this time was pure joy, unguarded, and entirely without caution. Her brother, alive, thinner than she remembered, and sitting a horse with a hard-won confidence he had not owned the last time she had seen him, and reaching her at nearly a full gallop to half fall from his saddle into an embrace that neither sibling seemed inclined to end any time soon. Izel's father allowed it, watching his two children with an expression that cracked, briefly, the whole grave authority he carried, and Gideon understood, watching a boy and his sister hold each other in the middle of 200 riders on a wind-swept ridge, exactly how much this reunion had cost this family to reach, and exactly how careful he needed to be with every word he said in the minutes that followed. Izel's father, a broad-shouldered man, whose weathered face carried the particular authority that never needed raised volume to command a room. A Nantan whose word 200 riders had followed across difficult country on nothing but trust, turned his attention to Gideon at last, like the longest few seconds of his life. Izel went first, quickly, in her own language, a rapid account Gideon could not follow word for word, but understood in its shape. The storm, the digging, the long fever nights, the winter of healing. Her father listened without interrupting, his eyes moving once to Gideon's face, reading something there with the same patient thoroughness Gideon had watched Izel apply to everything in her own careful ledger of trust. When her father finally addressed him, it was in careful, accented English, deliberately chosen, so the rancher standing before him would understand every word without translation. You dug my daughter from the snow with your own hands, when the easier choice and the safer one for a man alone would have been to ride past. His eyes held Gideon's, steady and unhurried. You gave her shelter and food and the honor of a door that closed and locked on her own terms, and you asked nothing of her in return that she did not choose freely to give. I have this from her own mouth, and I have watched her face while she gave it to me, and I know my daughter well enough to know true words when she speaks them. He paused, and in that pause Gideon became aware of 200 riders behind him waiting, and of the fact that whatever this man said next would ripple through every one of them, and eventually through the frightened town watching from a distance that had no idea yet what kind of moment this actually was. Among my people, the Nantan went on, a life saved creates a bond that is not lightly set aside. It is not debt in the way your people count debt, to be paid off and closed. It is closer to kinship. You did not save my daughter's life for gain, or for glory, expecting nothing in return. She has made this plain, and I believe her. That kind of honor is rare between our two peoples on either side of it. I did not ride 200 men across difficult country to bring war to a man who has shown my daughter nothing but honor. I rode them here to see the truth of what she gave me with my own eyes, and to make certain, in case any doubt remained in either direction, that this bond between you stands witnessed and respected by my whole band. He turned then and addressed the riders behind him in his own language, a brief statement that moved through the formation in a visible ripple, shoulders easing, weapons that had been carried ready settling back, the whole disciplined tension of 200 riders shifting, in the space of a few sentences, from watchful readiness into something closer to ceremony. Gideon, watching it happen, felt the fear that had sat cold in his chest since the panicked rider first reached his gate, finally began, cautiously, to loosen. Word of what had actually happened on that ridge reached town, far faster than the fear had carried by riders who had watched the whole exchange from a safe distance, and returned with a story considerably less alarming than the one that had sent half the town reaching for rifles that morning. By evening the panic had curdled somewhat sheepishly into curiosity, and by the next day into something that, in a town that had spent a full decade fearing exactly this kind of encounter, amounted to genuine, cautious respect, a story people carried between themselves in low, half-disbelieving voices. Prestige of an Apache Nantan riding 200 strong, not to burn a ranch to the ground, but to bless the man who had saved his daughter's life. Izel's father camped near the ranch 3 days, and in that time Gideon came to understand, through long conversations conducted in careful mixed English and Izel's patient translating, the fuller shape of the loss her family and her band had carried, the army sweep that scattered them, the months of searching and near starvation, the particular grief of a father who had spent 18 months not knowing whether his only daughter still lived in country that had shown her people very little mercy. He understood, listening, why Izel had carried herself with a wary, unbowed dignity he had first met in his own front room, a woman who had survived on her own competence and her own fierce refusal to break long before any rancher had dug her out of a snowdrift. On the third evening, with the whole camp gathered around a fire built at the edge of Gideon's own land, Izel's father brought both of them forward, and what followed was not a demand, but an offer, extended with the same unhurried authority he had carried onto that ridge 3 days before. "My daughter tells me she wishes to stay." He looked between them both. "I will not command her otherwise. She has earned, through everything this last winter, cost her the right to choose her own life, and I would not undo that by forcing a choice onto her now that is not truly hers to make freely. But I will say this to you, Gideon Marsh, in front of my whole band as witness, so there is no confusion of it later. If you take my daughter as your wife, you take her as she is, Chiricahua, proud of it, and never made to set that aside for you or for anyone. And you take the bond of her whole people alongside her, not as a burden, but as a kinship that will stand behind both of you for as long as either of us draws breath." Gideon looked at Izel and found her already watching him with the same steady, unbowed certainty he had come to recognize as entirely, unmistakably her own, and understood that whatever came out of him next was not really a question at all for either of them. It was simply the moment where the truth they had already built over an entire hard winter finally got given voice in front of witnesses. "I'm not looking to change one thing about who she is." Gideon met the Nantan's eyes without flinching. "I fell for the woman who argued with me over a plate of food the first morning she woke up in my house, not for some version of her that fit easier into this valley's comfort. If she'll have me, I'd be honored to marry her, and to stand behind her people the same way I'd expect them to stand behind her." Izel's father studied him a long moment, then gave one slow, final nod. The particular nod of a man closing a negotiation he had already privately decided the outcome of before it began. Around the fire, the gathered band made a low sound of approval that needed no translation at all. Izel herself stayed quiet a moment, and when she finally gave voice to it, it was not to her father, but to Gideon, carrying clearly across the fire to the whole gathered camp. "I did not stay on this land because I had nowhere else to go. My people would have taken me back the moment I found them, and I would have gone gladly, gratefully, to be among my own again." She held Gideon's eyes. "I stayed because somewhere in that long winter of fevers and mended fences and a house that stopped feeling like a stranger's house, I stopped counting the days until I could leave, and started counting instead how much I did not want to. That is my choice, made with a whole mind and nothing owed to anyone. I choose to stay. I choose you." They were married in the early spring when the last snow finally cleared from the high passes, and the valley began turning green again in the particular hopeful way it did every year after a hard winter, in a ceremony that honored both of their peoples rather than erasing either one. Izel's father gave the traditional words of blessing over the union in his own language, while half the town, invited and curious and no longer frightened, stood alongside 200 Chiricahua guests who had ridden back down from the foothills for the occasion, an assembly that would have been unthinkable to either community 8 months before, and now felt, to everyone gathered, like the most natural thing in the world. Gideon stood at that ceremony in a coat Izel had sewn herself, watching the woman he had once dug half-frozen out of a snowdrift stand before her own father and his own community, both unbowed and radiant and entirely fiercely herself, and felt something settle into place in his chest. Not a replacement for that first grief which he still carried and always would, but proof, standing right in front of him in the spring sunlight, that a heart broken that badly could still, against every hard lesson the last year had handed him, find room to hold something new and whole and entirely unexpected. The town's minister and Izel's father shared the small rise above the ranch that afternoon without either man treating the other's words as an obstacle to his own, the ceremony woven from both traditions in a way that felt, to everyone present, less like compromise than like two rivers finding the same wide valley to run through. There was cottonwood smoke and fiddle music both before the day was through, venison and beef, both turning on the same fires, and townsfolk who 8 months earlier would have reached for a rifle at the sight of a Chiricahua rider now sharing food and clumsy. laughing attempts at each other's languages with guests. They had spent a decade being taught to fear. Gideon's nearest neighbor, an old rancher who had muttered about a young fool wasting his savings the day Gideon first brought a stranger home from the snow, found Izel's father at the edge of the gathering that evening and, after a long, careful silence, extended a hand the Nantan accepted without hesitation. A small moment neither man made much of, and one that mattered in its quiet way more than any speech given that day. Izel's father did not simply ride off after the wedding and leave his daughter's new life behind him. The bond he had spoken of on that ridge held true through the seasons that followed. Chiricahua riders passed through the ranch regularly after that spring, welcomed guests rather than feared strangers, and Gideon's spread became, in its own quiet way, a bridge between two communities that had spent a hard decade learning only to fear each other. Izel never once set aside who she was to fit more comfortably into her new life. She wore her heritage plainly, and without apology, taught her own children when they came, both languages and both sets of stories, and stood in her own kitchen with the same fierce, unbowed dignity she had carried since the morning she first woke in a stranger's front room. He had wanted nothing then, and he wanted nothing more, all these years later, than the life the two of them had built together out of two separate, devastating losses, a rancher who had finally stopped running from his grief long enough to dig one freezing stranger out of the snow, and a woman who had survived 18 impossible months on nothing but her own strength and chosen, freely and on her own unbending terms, to build something new rather than simply endure whatever remained. Izel's brother stayed close to the ranch in the years that followed, riding between the foothills and Gideon's spread often enough that hands there stopped remarking on it, and grew from the lean, reckless boy on that ridge into a young man Gideon came, in time, to regard with something close to the affection he might have carried for a brother of his own. He taught Gideon things his own English-speaking world had no words for, and learned from him in turn, and the two of them built, alongside the deeper bond between Gideon and Izel, a friendship neither had expected the winter had room left in it to grow. Winters came and went after that on the Marsh ranch, some hard and some gentle, the way winters always do in that country, but none ever again carried the particular danger of that first screaming December blizzard, the night a widowed rancher nearly rode past a shape in the snow he almost convinced himself was nothing, and chose, in the last possible moment, to stop instead. Izel kept for the rest of her life a particular fondness for the first heavy snowfall of every season. Standing on the porch of the house that had once been a stranger's house, and had long since become simply home, watching the white come down over land that held, buried somewhere under all that quiet cold, the exact spot where two broken lives had found each other and decided against every hard lesson either of them had learned about loss, to try again. If you enjoyed riding along with Izel and Gideon tonight, give this video a like and subscribe for more frontier love stories every week, and we will see you in the next one.